The Australian protests. What's the real story?
All right, come on, Peter. I've got all the stuff for our anti-vaccination rally.
I don't believe this. It's bad enough you guys aren't vaccinating Stewie. Now you're trying to convince other people to make the same reckless choice?
I'm also gonna pet a bunch of dogs without asking.
Don't do that. We don't like that.
Then I'm gonna try and look at their teeth.
Brian, all we want is for parents to have the choice because parents know what's best for their kids.
Hey everyone, welcome to the video. Here we go through the bullshit and give you the facts. Today we're going to talk about protests. Some of the earlier dates, fines, arrest numbers may be incorrect due to a lack of information, but it helps to give you an idea. I did watch most of the live streams and can vouch for most of it, but unfortunately no longer available. I'll try and make separate videos for certain protests once I get some of the footage together. As for now, I'll show you the big one. Let's get into it. Over the years, protests have generally been used as a stance against restrictions against persons' freedoms or rights, and sometimes just to draw attention to the issue. For the last couple of years, the protests in Australia have been at an all-time high, yet they've been rarely seen in the mainstream media, and when they are, you've only been getting half of the story. There have been many people across a variety of areas that have been standing up, such as teachers, nurses, public transport, but mostly everyday Australian. So let's go back and put the story together, because once you've heard the real story, it really starts to make sense why there are so many happening today. So it first began roughly in April of 2020. Victoria had introduced some of the strictest lockdown policies in the country, and people began to stand up. It was kept quiet and not shown on the news. It has continued every Saturday since, and is still going on today over 2 years later. As time went on, people in other states began heading to their capital cities and joining the protests. Later that year in June, thousands of people marched through Australian cities and towns for Black Lives Matter protests on Saturday, defying an attempt from police to ban one demonstration through the courts, and despite pleas from the Prime Minister and state leaders for people to stay home. In a dramatic turn of events, a massive crowd in Sydney learned, just as they were gathering outside City's town hall, that the New South Wales Court of Appeal had ruled their rally was now lawful, overturning a court decision handed down late on Friday. At least 20 attended the Sydney march, which passed off peacefully, except for ugly scenes when police officers used pepper spray on protesters who had flowed into Central Station after the rally finished. Some protesters were hurt by the spray, with eyes streaming, and there were accusations that the remaining crowd had been forced together into a small space in the station and unable to move. As these protests ended, the lockdown protests went on, and the suppression and punishments continued to increase. By September, people were starting to be arrested in their homes for simply making a related post on social media. On September 5th, at a protest in Melbourne, 17 people were arrested and 160 fines were issued. These were certainly not the first. The following weekend, the protests went all weekend where they met with heavy police presence, including the riot squad. A further 88 people were arrested and another 226 fines were issued. The next weekend, another 16 were arrested. As lockdown restrictions were slowly lifted, the protests began to shrink. However, Victoria took the longest. Then, the vaccines were introduced, and the protests began to get loud again, now stronger than ever. As mandates were introduced, they grew and grew, and as they did, so did the police presence and brutality. To increase the numbers in the force, new recruits were hired and put onto the front lines with no experience. As we get to September of 2021, we saw the first major display of certain industries beginning to stand up. Construction workers protested outside their union headquarters. The government's response was to send riot police with rubber bullets and pepper spray to keep them in check. Then that night, shut down the construction industry for 2 weeks. Shortly after, about 50 frontline health workers began to protest with tape over their mouths and signs reading, "Not anti-vax, but pro-choice," or "Coercion is not consent." Approximately 30 minutes later, 200 Victorian police arrived and asked them to move on, or they would be fined or arrested. One after another, the people began to stand up, but they were not being listened to. So what did they do? Roughly 2 weeks at the beginning of February this year, inspired by the Canadian truckers, they decided to go right to the top. It became an event known as the Convoy to Canberra. And is something that every Australian really needs to see. How easily the people came together and made their own community is beyond words. It was one of the most beautiful things you will ever see in your life. People from all over the country headed towards Canberra. Convoy after convoy came from all over, from Perth to Townsville. Some from Tasmania even managed to make it, where they built camp and waited for others to arrive. Some stayed behind and held ground, while others would go and protest around Canberra. After a few days, police forced them out by ripping down tents and towing away cars. However, Exhibition Park was opening their doors and weren't even too worried about payment. As thanks, buckets were sent around the camp where protesters threw in what they could to show appreciation. This then became the new campground. As one convoy after another travelled across the country, they would stop and regroup. They were long journeys for some. Random strangers would be walking up to them and throwing $50 notes at people to pay for fuel or accommodation along the way because they were unable to make it but supported the cause. When they finally arrived, they were greeted at the gates by people celebrating their arrival. They continued protesting during the day and heading back to camp at night. As the community grew bigger and bigger, so did the structure. They went from a food tent, which had been donated by campers and even some of the locals who supported them, to a full cafeteria. They had school services and daycare for the children, doctors if you got sick, a church, live music, regular meetings. The list goes on. It had become its own little town. In the meantime, some of the roads were being shut down, both going into the camp and leading into Canberra. There were queues and queues of people. Once they had their numbers, Parliament House became their regular protest grounds. Then came the day that completely blew my mind, the 11th of February. I watched as the campers met up in the city before marching to Old Parliament House, where they were met by another group of protesters just as large. It was one of the biggest Australian protests in history. The number was never confirmed, but the people stretched from New Parliament House all the way down to the Old. There were a lot of people. They stood together, strong and proud, while singing We Are Australian and Waltzing Matilda, followed by a prayer, before marching up to the new Parliament House where they spent the rest of the day. It was amazing. As the day came to an end, some headed home, while others went back to camp. However, for the next 2 days, they were being ordered to leave the campgrounds before finally being pushed out. Some stayed behind and are still protesting every day, and others went back home and continued to protest in their state capital, which usually takes place every Saturday. We have also seen climate and abortion protests since, as well as certain industries taking place one after another. Which was Melbourne, where everyone around Australia convoyed to Melbourne for 5 days of protest, addressing multiple issues, from Julian Assange, to vaccine mandates, to the lies the media tells us. When will the government and businesses finally listen to these protesters and let them get back to living? When will the mandates be dropped so people can get back to work and help out with all these shortages we've been facing? How do you think they feel being unable to continue their career in the current economy? That's the end of the story. Let me know what you think in the comments. Help their algorithm out and press those buttons. But most importantly, stay happy, stay healthy, stay free.